The night was cold, the kind of cold that bit through layers and settled deep in the bones. The wind howled through the empty streets, rattling old street signs and sending loose papers tumbling like restless spirits. Streetlights flickered, their dim glow barely piercing the thick fog rolling in from the outskirts of the city. Somewhere in the distance, a faint sound echoed, a sharp, high-pitched cry. At first it was almost swallowed by the wind, just another noise in the restless night. But then it came again. A crying baby. Rex, a lone German shepherd, perked his ears, his breath forming pale clouds in the freezing air. His fur, matted and dusted with grime, bristled as his sharp eyes scanned the darkness. His paws were sore, his ribs visible beneath his unkempt coat, a sign of days without food. Yet, something about the desperate sound stirred something deep within him. He moved forward, his paws padding silently across the damp pavement. The cry grew louder, more urgent, sending a chill through his body that had nothing to do with the cold. He rounded a corner into a narrow alley where flickering neon signs cast eerie reflections in puddles of melted snow. And then he saw it, a small bundle wrapped in a thin blanket, abandoned near a dumpster. Rex's breath hitched. The tiny figure inside the blanket wriggled weakly, its cries raw and filled with fear. The scent of helplessness, of vulnerability, filled the air. The baby's skin was pale, its tiny fists clenched against the cold. For a moment, Rex hesitated. He had been ignored before, tossed aside like an inconvenience. He knew what abandonment felt like. He knew what it was to be unwanted. But this wasn't just another lonely soul. This was a life hanging by a thread. The German shepherd inched closer, his warm breath brushing against the baby's face. The crying softened for a moment as if the tiny human could somehow sense the presence of something protective, something that wouldn't leave. Rex glanced around. The alley was deserted, silent except for the occasional gust of wind. Whoever had left the baby here, they were long gone. Then suddenly, a noise, a faint shuffle from the far end of the alley, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. Rex's ears flattened, his instincts screamed danger. Someone was watching. His heart pounded as he stood protectively over the baby, his body tense. The shadows near the alley's entrance stretched unnaturally long, the figure lurking just out of sight. And then, just before the darkness swallowed them entirely, the person turned and ran. Rex let out a low, warning growl. Whoever had abandoned the baby, they weren't expecting someone, or something, to intervene, and they definitely hadn't expected him. Rex stood motionless, his breath fogging in the cold air as he listened for any sign of the person who had just fled the alley. His ears twitched, scanning for movement, but the city had swallowed them whole, vanished like a shadow retreating from the light. The baby let out another weak cry, its tiny body shivering beneath the thin, damp blanket. Rex turned his gaze downward, his deep brown eyes softening. This fragile, helpless thing had been left here to die, just like him. He stepped closer, his claws clicking softly against the pavement. The scent of the baby was unlike anything he had ever known. Milk, warmth, and something else. Fear. His nose brushed against the bundle and the baby stirred slightly, its little hands grasping at the air as if searching for comfort. Rex let out a low whimper. He didn't understand human cruelty, but he understood pain. He understood loneliness. For a long moment, he simply stood there, his body acting as a shield against the wind. His instincts screamed at him to do something. But what? Then the baby's cry faded into small, stuttering breaths, too weak, too cold. Rex's heart pounded. He couldn't just stand here. He had to move. The German shepherd lowered his head, carefully taking the edge of the blanket between his teeth. His grip was gentle, cautious. He knew how fragile this tiny life was. With slow, deliberate movements, he lifted the baby and began to walk. The street stretched endlessly before him, desolate and quiet. His tired limbs ached, but he pressed on, ignoring the hunger gnawing at his belly, the cold seeping into his bones. He didn't know where he was going. He only knew he had to get the baby somewhere safe, Miles away, a man sat alone in his small apartment, staring at the clock. Detective James Carter hadn't slept in over 24 hours. His hands tightened around the steaming mug of coffee he barely tasted. Something was wrong. The call had come in earlier that evening. A neighbor had heard strange sounds, a muffled argument, a door slamming. When officers arrived, the apartment was empty. No signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle. But something felt off. Then came the missing child report. A newborn, only days old, gone without a trace. James had been on the force long enough to recognize a case that smelled rotten, and this one reeked. He had an itch in the back of his mind, the kind he had learned to trust. Someone had taken that child, or worse, abandoned them. He rubbed a hand down his face, exhaustion settling in. Somewhere out there, a helpless baby was alone in the night, and he had no leads. But he didn't know that, at that very moment, help was already on the way. Rex's paws left imprints in the frost-dusted pavement as he moved through the quiet streets. His breath came in steady, controlled puffs, his ears flicking at every distant sound. Something inside him told him to hurry. A faint glow appeared ahead, the warm, welcoming light of a house just beyond the alley's end. He had seen it before, walked past it many times. It smelled of food, of safety, of someone kind. With careful steps, he approached the door and placed the baby gently on the porch. Then, he barked. Not a warning, not a threat, a call for help. Inside, James Carter froze mid-sip of his coffee. His head snapped toward the door. A dog's bark, sharp and urgent, shattered the silence of the night. He set his mug down, instincts flaring. He had heard thousands of barks in his life, but this one was different. It was desperate. Cautiously, he approached the door, peering through the peephole. His brows knitted together. A German shepherd? Another bark. Then, a sound that sent ice through his veins. A baby, crying. James flung the door open and his breath caught in his throat. The German shepherd stood protectively over a tiny bundled. For Michor, James' heart pounded as he crouched down, his fingers trembling as he reached for the blanket. The dog didn't move. He simply watched, his body still tense, his eyes filled with something James couldn't quite place. The moment he pulled back the blanket and saw the tiny, fragile face beneath, everything clicked. James looked at the dog, then back at the baby. "What the hell?" he whispered. Then, as realization set in, as the pieces of a much darker puzzle began falling into place, James noticed something that made his blood run cold. The dog wasn't just watching him, he was staring past him, back toward the shadows. James followed his gaze, and that's when he saw it. Footprints, leading away from the porch, fresh ones. Someone had been here, and they weren't far. James Carter's heart pounded as he followed the German shepherd's intense gaze toward the darkened street beyond his porch. The footprints in the frost-covered ground were fresh, too fresh. Someone had been standing there, watching, and they had left in a hurry. The baby let out a small whimper, shifting beneath the blanket. James snapped back to reality. He needed to act, fast. He scooped the baby up with careful hands, feeling the tiny, fragile weight against his chest. His fingers instinctively pressed to the baby's neck. A pulse, weak but steady. Relief flooded through him, but it was short-lived. He looked down at the dog, who was still standing guard, ears pinned forward, every muscle tensed as if expecting danger to lunge from the shadows. "Where did you find the baby?" James murmured, almost to himself. The German shepherd huffed, then turned his head slightly, glancing back toward the alley. James exhaled, his cop instincts flaring. The dog knew something. James rushed inside, closing the door behind him. He placed the baby on the couch, wrapping it in a warm fleece blanket before reaching for his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen. Who did he call first? Child Protective Services, the hospital, the precinct? Then his eyes flicked back to the dog who had followed him inside and now sat motionless by the door. His coat was rough, dirty, and his ribs jutted out from hunger. This wasn't someone's pet. This was a survivor. James crouched down, meeting the dog's deep, knowing eyes. "You found this baby for a reason, didn't you?" he whispered. The dog didn't move, but his breathing was steady, his posture unwavering. It wasn't the look of an animal acting on impulse. It was the look of a protector who had seen something he shouldn't have. James rubbed his temples. This was more than just an abandoned child. Someone had left that baby out there, and that someone had been watching. His gut twisted. He opened his laptop, typing furiously into the police database. Missing children reports. He needed to see if this baby had been reported. Several files loaded on his screen. James skimmed through them, his eyes narrowing. Most were months old, until he hit one from just a few hours ago. Infant reported missing. Unknown suspect, last seen midnight. James inhaled sharply. This was it, but something was off. The report was vague, too vague. No family names, no photos. Just a short, clinical entry. Why was there so little detail? His stomach tightened. Then, a notification popped up. New entry added, police record. Sealed. His blood ran cold. Sealed? Already? That was unusual. No, that was impossible. Why would a missing baby's report be locked behind restricted access? Unless someone didn't want anyone looking. James's fingers clenched into fists. This wasn't just a case of neglect. Someone wanted this baby gone. He turned back to the German shepherd. You saw something, didn't you? The dog simply stared. Back in the alley, the darkness stirred. A lone figure stood in the shadows, watching the house from a distance. Their breath was slow, calculated. They had seen the dog. They had seen the man take the baby inside. Their lips curled into a sneer. This wasn't supposed to happen. The baby was supposed to disappear. And now. So was the man who found it. James's pulse raced as he stood, pacing the room. His gut told him that whoever left this baby wasn't just some scared, reckless parent. This was bigger. He knelt down beside the shepherd. You led the baby here. Because you knew someone would help, didn't you? The dog blinked once. James studied him. He had seen military dogs before, intelligent, disciplined, trained to follow instinct. This one was no different. You're not just some stray, James murmured. You belonged to someone once. Someone who taught you how to think, how to survive. His eyes flickered back to the baby, now fast asleep, tiny fingers curled around the blanket. And then, he saw it, a small marking on the baby's wrist, barely visible in the dim light, but unmistakable. A brand. James inhaled sharply. He had seen this mark before at black market trafficking cases. His hands trembled as pieces of the puzzle slammed into place. This wasn't just an abandoned baby. This child had been part of something much, much worse, and someone wanted to erase them. His throat tightened. Jesus. The baby stirred, its tiny face scrunching as if sensing the unease in the air. James turned to the dog, realization settling deep in his bones. You stopped it, didn't you? The shepherd remained still. But James didn't need words to know the truth. The dog had intervened. He had gotten in the way, and if that was the case, someone would come looking for him too. James grabbed his phone, his heartbeat erratic. He needed to get the baby to safety. He needed backup. But before he could dial, the dog suddenly let out a low, rumbling growl. James froze. The shepherd's ears flattened, his body tense, his gaze locked on the front door. And then, a slow, deliberate knock echoed through the house. James's breath caught. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows. But nothing else moved. No footsteps, no voices, just silence. James reached for his gun, every nerve in his body on high alert. He stepped toward the door, the dog at his side, muscles coiled like a spring ready to snap. Another knock. This time harder. James's throat tightened. He placed his hand on the doorknob, then stopped. A single white envelope had been slipped beneath the door. His fingers trembled as he picked it up. Inside was a small handwritten note. Stay out of this, or you'll disappear too. James's stomach dropped. This wasn't just about the baby anymore. They knew he had the child, and now they were coming for them both. The silence in the house stretched, thick and suffocating. James Carter held the white envelope between his fingers, the handwritten words burning into his mind. "Stay out of this, or you'll disappear too." His grip tightened. Whoever had abandoned that baby knew. They knew where the child was. They knew. He had taken them in, and worse, they weren't finished. The German shepherd remained by the door, his muscles tense, his hackles raised in silent warning. A low growl rumbled from his chest. Deep, primal. He sensed something James couldn't see. James moved quickly, securing all the locks on his door. His cop instincts screamed at him. This wasn't just a warning. It was a promise. He grabbed his phone, dialing the precinct. The line rang twice before an automated message cut in. "This number is no longer in service." James frowned, his pulse spiking. That wasn't possible. He redialed. Same message. A cold realization settled over him. His calls were being blocked. Someone was pulling strings. His stomach twisted as he scrolled through his contacts. He tried his partner's number. Then the department's emergency line. Nothing. Whoever was behind this had influence, enough to cut off his direct access to law enforcement. James set the phone down, exhaling slowly. He was on his own, and now he had 2 lives depending on him. German Shepherd's ears perked suddenly. His body went rigid. Then James heard it too. A car. The slow hum of an engine idling down the street, headlights off, creeping closer. James moved toward the window, careful to stay in the shadows. Peering through the blinds, he spotted it, a dark SUV, barely visible. Under the dim glow of the streetlight, it didn't park. It didn't speed away. It waited. James's breath came slow and controlled, but his mind was racing. Someone was watching. Maybe they were waiting for him to panic, to make a mistake. He glanced at the shepherd, who hadn't taken his eyes off the window. The dog's body remained still, but James could see it, the barely restrained tension coiling in his frame. He recognized that car. James knelt beside him, voice low. "Whoever did this, you've seen them before, haven't you?" The shepherd gave a sharp exhale, his ears flicking back. James looked at the baby, still wrapped in the warm fleece blanket, breathing softly. They had no time. Whoever was out there wouldn't just sit and wait forever, they would move. And when they did, James needed to be ready. Outside, inside the dark SUV, a man sat gripping the steering wheel. His face was hidden beneath the shadows, but his eyes were sharp, trained on the house. He reached for his phone, dialing a number. It rang once before. Someone picked up. "Report." A cold, measured voice responded on the other end. "He has the baby. The dog, too." A pause. Then, "Handle it." The line went dead. The man in the SUV exhaled, his fingers tapping against the dashboard. His orders were clear, and this time, there would be no mistakes. Inside, James moved fast. He grabbed a duffel bag, stuffing it with essentials. Water, baby formula, blankets, his off-duty firearm. His hands worked quickly, efficiently. Years as a detective had taught him one thing. When you're being hunted, you don't wait to become the prey. He turned to the shepherd. "You ready, buddy?" The dog let out a low grunt. "Ready." James scooped the baby into his arms, securing the fleece around its tiny body. He flicked off the lights in the house, ensuring he stayed hidden in the darkness. Then, with one last deep breath, he unlocked the back door, the one leading to the alley. If they were watching the front, he'd go out the back. James stepped into the freezing night, his breath fogging in the air. The alley was dark, the city around him eerily silent. His boots crunched softly against the frost-covered ground. The shepherd moved beside him, alert, ears flicking at every distant sound. They moved quickly, sticking to the shadows. If he could make it to his car without being seen, they had a chance. A block away, parked behind an abandoned building, was his vehicle. A battered sedan, but reliable. James tightened his grip on the baby and kept moving. Then the streetlight above them flickered, and suddenly, footsteps. Fast, heavy, coming straight for them. James turned sharply. In the darkness, he saw them, two men emerging from the alley. Behind them, their faces were obscured, but their movements were precise, trained. James cursed under his breath. Not some thugs. These were professionals. The shepherd's growl deepened, his body coiling like a spring. He knew. These men weren't here to negotiate. James's mind raced. Fighting wasn't an option, not with the baby in his arms. There was only one choice: run. James bolted down the alley, his muscles screaming as he sprinted toward the car. The baby let out a startled cry, but he didn't slow down. The shepherd was right beside him, paws striking the pavement with rapid precision. Behind them, shouts, "Stop him!" James didn't look back. He could hear their footsteps. They were gaining 50 feet. The car was close, 30 feet. He reached into his pocket, fumbling for the keys. 20 feet. Then, gunfire. A shot rang out, echoing through the alley. The E sound sliced through the night like a knife. James dove, twisting his body to shield the baby as he hit the ground. Pain flared through his shoulder. He had been grazed. A warning shot. The shepherd snapped. With a feral growl, the dog lunged. A blur of fur and teeth. The nearest man barely had time to react before the German shepherd collided with him, knocking him backward. The second man hesitated, just long enough. James gritted his teeth, forcing himself up. His shoulder burned, but he ignored it. With one last push, he reached the car. He yanked the door open, threw the baby inside, and jumped into the driver's seat. The shepherd, hot blood on his muzzle, turned at James's sharp whistle. "In!" The dog launched into the car just as James slammed the door shut. The second man lunged, but too late. James threw the car into gear, tires screeching against the pavement. As he sped down the street, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The men were still standing there, but they weren't running after him. They didn't need to. James's stomach twisted as he saw one of them pull out a phone. Whoever was behind this, they weren't done yet. And now, they knew exactly where he was going. James's knuckles were white against the steering wheel, his mind racing as the city lights blurred past. His shoulder throbbed where the bullet had grazed him, but pain was the least of his worries. The baby in the back seat stirred, letting out a soft, sleepy whimper, unaware of the chaos surrounding them. And beside him, the German shepherd sat motionless, his deep brown eyes locked on the road ahead. Despite the blood on his muzzle, despite the violence he had just fought through, he didn't look shaken. He looked focused. James exhaled sharply, forcing himself to think. He couldn't go to the hospital. Not yet. If those men had access to police records, they would have eyes everywhere. No, he needed somewhere safe. His mind flicked to a place, his cabin, tucked deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. It was the only place where no one would find them. If he could just make it there, he could figure out what to do next. James turned off the main highway, heading toward the mountains. As the neon signs and city streets disappeared behind him, a heavy silence settled in the car. For the first time in hours, he felt like he could breathe. An hour later, James pulled into a narrow dirt driveway surrounded by thick pines. His cabin stood at the edge of a frozen lake, barely visible beneath the moonlight. He parked the car and exhaled, the tension in his chest easing, at least for now. The shepherd shifted in his seat, ears flicking toward the baby in the back. James glanced at him, shaking his head. "You really don't take your eyes off her, do you?" The dog didn't respond. He didn't need to. James stepped out and carefully lifted the baby, cradling the small bundle against his chest. The cold air bit at his skin, but the baby remained warm beneath the fleece blanket. The shepherd jumped down, stretching his tired limbs before trotting up the porch steps ahead of James. He paused at the door, sniffing once before looking back. James understood, checking for threats. "Good boy," he murmured, unlocking the door and stepping inside. The cabin was small but sturdy, wooden floors, a stone fireplace, shelves lined with old books. The air smelled of pine and worn leather, of a life that had once been peaceful. Not anymore. James set the baby down on the couch, his fingers brushing against the infant's tiny hand. The baby stirred, letting out a small sigh before settling back into sleep. James ran a hand over his face, exhaustion hitting him hard. He needed sleep, but his mind wouldn't let him rest. Then he felt something press against his leg. He looked down. The German Shepherd was sitting beside him, eyes locked onto his face. James exhaled. "You're not gonna let me fall apart, are you?" The Shepherd blinked. James shook his head, rubbing his temples. "All right, I get it. You're in charge now." The dog huffed as if in agreement. For the first time in years, James let out a quiet chuckle. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows against the walls. James sat on the couch, bandaging his shoulder. The pain was manageable, but the nagging thought in his mind wasn't. Someone wanted this baby gone, and they were willing to kill to make that happen. James sighed, glancing toward the Shepherd, who was curled up beside the couch, still watching the baby. He had been like this since they found her, always watching, always protecting. James studied him. "You were there, weren't you?" he said softly. The Shepherd's ears flicked. "You saw who left her." The dog didn't move. James rubbed his jaw. "And you stopped them." A slow exhale left his chest. This wasn't just coincidence. The Shepherd hadn't just stumbled upon the baby, he had been fighting to keep her alive. James leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "You've been through hell, haven't you, buddy?" The dog's eyes softened. James knew that look. He had seen it before, in the mirror. A survivor's look. He let out a slow breath. "You saved her, and I owe you for that." The Shepherd simply blinked. James reached down, hesitating only for a moment before placing his palm against the dog's scarred head. The Shepherd leaned into his touch. James swallowed the lump in his throat. "Guess we're in this together now." For the first time since this nightmare began, the tension in the room lifted. The baby was safe. The Shepherd had found his purpose, and James had just made a promise. No matter what it took, he wouldn't let anyone take this child away. The fire had burned low, its glow barely illuminating the cabin's darkened interior. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the wooden walls like distant whispers. James sat in the worn leather chair near the hearth, gun in hand, eyes locked on the front door. He couldn't shake the feeling. They would come. The people who had abandoned the baby, the ones who had left the ones who had nearly killed him in that alley. They weren't done. And now, out here in the wilderness, they had him exactly where they wanted. He wasn't waiting around to find out what happened next. James pushed himself to his feet, his injured shoulder screaming in protest. He moved quickly, grabbing the duffel bag he had packed earlier and stuffing in more supplies, water, food, extra ammunition. He turned to the couch where the baby lay wrapped in fleece, her tiny chest rising and falling in steady sleep. And beside her, the German Shepherd sat alert, ears flicking toward every distant sound. He hadn't rested, not really, because he knew too. James crouched beside him. "We need to move, buddy." The Shepherd didn't react at first. Then, as if understanding the weight of those words, he stood. James scooped the baby into his arms, holding her close as he moved toward the back door, the one leading to the dense tree line. If he could get to his truck parked a mile down the hidden trail, they had a chance. They could disappear. But just as his fingers touched the door handle, the Shepherd let out a deep, guttural growl. James froze. Then, a sound, a car engine. Slow, approaching. James's pulse spiked as he moved to the window, barely lifting the curtain. Headlights cut through the darkness. An SUV, the same one from before. It stopped just at the edge of the driveway, engine humming. The doors didn't open. No one stepped out. They were waiting. James's stomach twisted. They were trying to trap him. His fingers tightened around the baby. He had to get out. Now, he turned to the Shepherd. "Go." The Shepherd darted forward, leading the way as James slipped into the night. The trees swallowed them, the cold air sharp against his skin. The ground was rough beneath his boots, the snow crunching softly as he moved. The Shepherd ran ahead, pausing every few seconds to check behind him, guiding James through the safest path. They moved fast. But so did the men. A second engine roared. To life, another vehicle. Then footsteps. James's breath hitched. They weren't alone in the woods. The baby let out a small whimper, sensing the rising tension. James held her closer, whispering, "Shh, baby, stay with me." The shepherd growled low, turning sharply to face the shadows behind them. James did the same, his free hand reaching for his gun. Then, movement, a flash of light, a voice. "He's in the trees. Move in." James clenched his jaw. No time. He bolted. The shepherd ran alongside him, silent and fast. Shots rang out behind them, bullets striking bark, splintering into the darkness. But James didn't stop. Through the trees, the faint outline of his truck appeared, parked where he had left it. Hope surged in his chest. They could make it. Then, just as he reached the clearing, a figure stepped in front of him. James skidded to a halt, raising his weapon. But before he could fire, the shepherd lunged. A snarl ripped through the air as the dog collided with the man, knocking him to the ground. James didn't hesitate. He ran. He yanked the truck door open, slid inside, and placed the baby in the passenger seat. "Stay with me, little one," he murmured. The shepherd turned just as James slammed his fist against the horn. The loud blare startled the men behind him. It was all the opening the dog needed. He bolted toward the truck, leaping into the passenger's side just as James threw it into reverse. Tires spun against the dirt, kicking up snow and gravel. The men shouted, their shadows growing smaller in the rearview mirror. Then, gunfire. The back window shattered. James grit his teeth and floored the gas pedal, the truck fishtailing as they tore down the frozen road. The shepherd crouched low, shielding the baby with his body. James's hands shook against the wheel. They had barely escaped. But this wasn't over. Not even close. The winding road stretched endlessly through the frozen wilderness, the truck's tires crunching over patches of ice and gravel. James kept his grip firm on the wheel, his mind racing, even as exhaustion clawed at his body. His shoulder throbbed, his heartbeat still erratic from the chase. But he couldn't stop. Not yet. Beside him, the German shepherd sat tense, his deep brown eyes locked on the baby wrapped in the fleece blanket. The child hadn't stirred since they left the woods, her tiny breaths steady but faint. James exhaled slowly, his knuckles whitening as he pressed down on the gas. He needed somewhere truly safe, somewhere off-grid, somewhere no one could find them. And he knew just the place. 2 hours later, James pulled onto a barely visible dirt path, one that twisted deep into the mountains. The thick forest swallowed them whole, the road narrowing as trees closed in on either side. Snow dusted the branches, the air thick with silence. Then finally, his destination came into view. A secluded hunting cabin, smaller than his usual place, tucked between the towering pines. He had bought it years ago, back when he was still working undercover. A last resort. Tonight it was exactly that. James killed the engine. The silence was suffocating for a moment, the only sound his ragged breathing. Then, he turned to the shepherd. "We made it, buddy." The dog didn't relax. His ears were still perked, his body still tense, waiting, watching. James opened the door, stepping out carefully. The air was sharp, the kind of cold that bit through layers. He reached inside, scooping up the baby, her warmth pressing against his chest. The shepherd jumped down beside him, moving to his side like a shadow. Together they approached the cabin. James pushed the door open, his boots creaking against the wooden floor. Inside, the air was stale but safe. A fireplace sat in the corner, old but reliable. A few blankets were draped over a worn-out couch. It wasn't much, but it was enough. James wasted no time. He carefully placed the baby on the couch, wrapping her in another layer before turning to the fireplace. His fingers worked quickly, striking. A match against the kindling. Flames flickered, stretching upward, casting a warm glow against the cabin walls. He turned back to check on the baby. She was still asleep, tiny hands curled into fists. So small, so fragile. James swallowed, then knelt down beside the shepherd. You kept her alive, he murmured. The dog blinked at him, his expression unreadable. James exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. His exhaustion was hitting hard now, but he couldn't afford to collapse. Not yet. He reached into the duffel bag, pulling out a can of dog food he had grabbed in a rush. I don't know how long you've been out there, he said, peeling back the lid, but I know you're hungry. He placed the food on the floor. Theoui. Shepard hesitated. James frowned. Go ahead, it's yours. But the dog didn't move toward the food. Instead, his gaze flickered toward the baby again. Watching, guarding. James let out a quiet breath. He wouldn't eat until he knew she was safe. Something twisted in his chest. This dog had been through hell. But somehow, even after everything, he still had purpose. James reached out slowly, running his fingers over the shepherd's scarred ear. You've been protecting her since the start, haven't you? The dog blinked. Then finally, he lowered his head, pressing into James's touch. A small, unspoken bond clicked into place. James smiled faintly. Yeah, I get it, buddy. We're in this together now. For the first time that night, the shepherd turned away from the baby and began to eat. James leaned back against the couch, his exhaustion pulling him down. His body ached, his mind still spinning. But the warmth of the fire, the steady breaths of the baby, and the silent presence of the dog beside him made something settle deep inside him. They were safe. For now. But this wasn't over. Not even close. The thigh. Fire crackled softly, its warmth spreading through the small cabin. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees. But for the first time in hours, the world felt still. Safe. James sat on the worn-out couch, his injured shoulder aching, exhaustion weighing heavy on his limbs. He watched the tiny baby, now bundled securely, her chest rising and falling in peaceful sleep. And beside her, the dog. The German shepherd lay close, his body curled just enough to shield her, his eyes half-lidded but still alert. He had barely moved since they arrived, refusing to rest fully, refusing to let his guard down. Even after everything, he was still protecting her. James swallowed, something tightening in his throat. He had seen loyalty before, but not like this. Not this pure. The baby let out a soft noise, shifting slightly in her sleep. The shepherd lifted his head instantly, ears flicking toward her, his nose pressed gently against her blanket, checking, making sure she was okay. James exhaled. You really won't stop, will you? The dog didn't look at him. He just lowered his head again, resting it near the baby's tiny form, his body a silent promise. James ran a hand through his hair, staring at the fire. His mind replayed everything. The alley, the gunfire, the men who wanted this child gone. Someone had thrown her away. But this dog, he had saved her. Through hunger, through exhaustion, through danger. He had fought to keep her alive. And now, even here, even in warmth and safety, he still wouldn't let go. James swallowed hard. You lost someone, didn't you? He murmured. The shepherd's ears twitched. James's chest tightened. That was it, wasn't it? Maybe once, a long time ago, he had belonged to someone. Maybe he had known love, known a family. And then, just like this baby, he had been left behind. James reached out, his fingers brushing against the shepherd's scarred fur. You weren't supposed to make it either. The dog lifted his gaze, his deep brown eyes meeting James's, and for the first time, they understood each other. A survivor's. Look, James let out a slow breath, leaning back against the couch. His body ached, his mind still racing with questions. But none of it mattered right now because tonight, for the first time in a long time, they weren't alone. The shepherd closed his eyes, his breathing deepening. And James knew. No matter what happened next, no matter who came looking, they weren't just running anymore, they were fighting back. The cabin was silent, save for the gentle crackling of the fire. The baby slept soundly, safe and warm. The German Shepherd for the first time had let his guard down, his body curled protectively near her. James sat in the dim light staring at the flames, his mind restless. Who had left the baby in that alley? Why was her case erased from police records? And most importantly, who was still out there watching? His fingers tightened around the edge of the fleece blanket covering the baby. He wasn't just a cop caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was in the middle of something bigger. Then his phone buzzed, a blocked number. James hesitated, then answered. A deep, distorted voice crackled through the speaker. "You shouldn't have taken her." James's pulse spiked. He glanced at the baby, at the dog. A slow, steady breath left his chest. Too late. They had already chosen their side. James hung up, set the phone down, and whispered, "Come find me, the eye." German Shepherd lifted his head, eyes gleaming in the firelight. Whatever was coming, they'd be ready.